It is late December, a time of intense baking heat. I go for a long walk across our landscape where a once green, diverse grassland sward smells like freshly cut hay as the plant sugars dry. Listening to the morning bird chorus, which is overridden by the warbling of magpies, I contemplate the connections and interconnections of our world on the farm, of flowering trees and shrubs, insect hatchings, temperature, atmospheric pressure, wind currents, aerial odour streams, and thousands of other factors that trigger and enable this ancient movement of birds, insects and other creatures across our landscapes. By mid-morning, on the older parts of our landscape, large patches of vanilla lilies unfurl their pastel flowers beneath candlebark and snow gums. Around them, bees buzz, bathed in rich scent, while orbs of rich yellow button daisies present their curled, silver-side leaves to the thirsty sun. Beyond them, open grasslands are stippled with white flecks of flowering Danthonia. This is butterfly, insect and arthropod time. A common brown butterfly among the candlebarks falls like a dead gum leaf, twisting to earth, only to suddenly spread wings and glide away, while painted ladies delicately flit from flower to flower. Other insects fill the air, the subdued hum of flies, the loud buzz of demonic, single-minded Christmas beetles, the quavering thrumming of grass cicadas, and the clustering of lost bogong moths on a fence post. And then the slow waking of black prince cicadas, red-eyed and torpid in the morning, but then, as they warm, their full foot song beginning in scratchy fashion and then rising en masse into a deep humming buzz that resonates in the eucalypt canopies. And I could go on, but that sort of captures part of what our landscape is as you walk through it. Yeah.
I heard about Charles just basically through the regenerative agriculture movement, and I knew that this book was in process. So when I got a phone call saying, would you come along and help me at the launch, it was like, bing, because I think as you'll see from the book, Charles is wanting this message to go out to you. He doesn't want it kept in the halls of agriculture. He doesn't want it kept in the halls of academia. For this change, for this manifesto to drive its thread into the community, it has to be through everyday people like you and me, and us taking it to those in our spheres of influence so that this serious change can take place. And I mentioned to Charles just earlier that David Holmgren, the co-originator of permaculture, is currently about to publish a book. And I think in terms of this underground movement, when you have two books of this calibre coming out, the bubbles and the ramifications and the ripples are really starting to come to the surface, because David Holmgren is a massive thinker, and he's been working for 40 years on alternatives to the current paradigm and on alternatives to living sustainably. And he's brought it back to his book, which is called Retro Suburbia, and he says the way we'll move forward is by retrofitting suburbia, because that's where we all live. And this is exactly what Charles wants. He wants his message to get into suburbia, because it's those of us in suburbia that are driving the agriculture, which is creating the problems, and which he's now seeing the alternative for, which is a regenerative approach. So, Charles, welcome to Sydney.
Thanks, Costa.
I know you've been on a bit of a run. Where have you been in the last couple of weeks?
Last night in Melbourne, where I lost my bag while we were talking. Canberra, right throughout the bush. But I'll just preface our discussion by, first of all, thanking the State Library and Sam, but particularly thank you all for coming. And to Costa. I mean, there's no accident that we asked him, because I just think Costa's role in cutting through to all generations and bringing healthy food off healthy soils, etc., to the notice of a wide public is just fantastic. So thanks, mate. It's great you could be here.
I'm blushing. You just can't see it.
So your question was
Yeah. So how's the first couple or the last few weeks gone with the launching?
No, look, we're into about a fifth reprint, and we're about to sign with an American publisher. So I think what that's telling us is books of this nature, and as you say, David Holmgren, I'm glad to hear he's publishing. He's one of the great thinkers in this field. There's obviously a need out there, and I think part of that, even though people aren't fully informed, those of us that are know that our Earth now has entered into a new epoch, a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. And where I am at ANU, just down the corridor, are some of the leaders in the world committees on climate and other systems. And there's just no doubt that 95% of thousands of the world scientists are convinced that we're now into this dangerous new phase caused by humans, not just through carbon, but a whole lot of other issues. And it's the greatest crisis that our Earth and humanity has ever faced. And that's the background, big picture, and the negative story. But the book that we'll be talking about is all about solutions and hope, and a regenerative agriculture that can pull carbon out, fix up water systems, landscapes, etc., as well as delivering healthy food full of nutrients for people, is a key answer to some of the problems of the Anthropocene. Rather than just being exhorted to not do things, we now know some of the solutions to address it. So I think that's the story of hope and excitement in this whole picture, which you talk about with food, etc., etc.
Interesting. You talk about the Anthropocene. Studying landscape architecture, I remember we had to look at anthropometrics in terms of design. And you know that classic drawing of the person and all of this, and anthropo, of course, from the Greek word man, and metrics, measurement of humans, and then the Anthropocene, meaning this period of time where we are having an impact on this planet, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, is really an interesting phase. But before we sort of go into that, I just wanted to reel the clock back a little bit and just get some background on Charlie to put him in context for you. So, Charlie, you grew up on the land. Whereabouts was the family farm?
Yes, I grew up an area called the Monero, the Snowy Mountains, beautiful temperate grasslands on the eastern side of the Snowy Mountains. So it's tough country, dry winters, but like all tougher country, it's lean and beautiful. And so that was my apprenticeship growing up. And I was always a keen naturalist, stimulated by a primary teacher, which is really important. I think the role of teachers if it's ever needed, it's now to pull our kids off devices and back to engaging with nature. And so I then went off to university in the early 70s, just at that time when all the exciting thinking was coming out on ecology. Doing zoology, I wanted to be a wildlife researcher. So I did zoology and the first course in Australia on holistic thinking called human ecology. And then my father had a heart attack when I was 22, and being an only child, I decided I'd go back and run the farm. But growing up on a farm doesn't mean you know anything about managing a farm. And so I could write a book on all the mistakes I made, and some of them are in this book. Ploughing soil on steep country and watching it wash down the hill, and what's called set stocking, leaving animals in a landscape and they ate the heart out of the perennial grasses and so on. And then I moved on because of my science background. We evolved a new type of merino sheep with a new type of fibre using molecular genetics and biology and things. And it also evolved into an animal welfare friendly sheep, that this merino type of sheep, we didn't have to mules, didn't use chemical therefore for flies. And I noticed after servicing hundreds of clients across 6 states and driving a lot of 70,000 Ks a year at times, it's a wonder my wife's still with me. So I was reading the landscapes, I was learning to read the degradation, but a lot of the clients I was picking up who were interested in this new type of sheep in a very traditional industry, with what you'd call the early adopters, and quite a number were into this new type of agriculture. And that really got me thinking. And so in my late 50s, I went back to my alma mater at ANU and did a PhD looking more at the social side. What made these guys flip? And out of that really came the book. I interviewed 80 leading regenerative farmers and then a lot more since. And so I guess that's part of the journey, but plenty of mistakes in it, yeah.
Wow, so, you were dragged back to the farm for family reasons. You worked it for 35 years and then you went back to uni in 2009 to do a PhD. That's a pretty big step in terms of just shifting away from what could have been a sort of quiet space on the farm. What drove it?
I'd always been interested in writing and had published a few books on the merino industry and the destruction of the wool industry through politics. So I had that side, and but landing at uni in your late 50s with compatriot PhDs in their 20s who were very electronically literate was a challenge, I can tell you. But I knew how to cut the corners and they didn't, so that was a help. Yeah. But it was a good synergy of young enthusiasm and the Fenner School at ANU is a remarkable multidisciplinary school, human ecology, soil science, some of Australia's top biodiversity scientists, and I had friends from my youth, because when I was an undergraduate I did a lot of climbing, and some of those guys were leaders in CSIRO, and so it was a great environment to go back to.
So as you prepared to head back into that, you'd received an OAM for service to research organisations around wool. What were you doing to get that sort of an accolade?
I'm not particularly sure. I think it was more a recognition of some of the things that had been done in the wool industry collectively, to be frank. But I'd served on international genetic review committees and Australian wool boards, which is what I was the only farmer appointed to wool boards since the 30s that hadn't come out of politics, because I was very sceptical of it. And so Simon Crean put me on them as a change agent, and I was promptly booted off after 2 years for being a change agent. And then when I exposed what was really... by then I came to realise that... won't sidetrack this too much, but what had happened in 1991 when politicians, through about 5 or 6 federal cabinets, had tried to stack the market in wool in a protected floor price scheme. When that collapsed in 91, it pretty much destroyed an entire wool industry. We lost half our customers and the price didn't recover until only the last few years. And it had been covered up effectively, and I wrote a book exposing that and was worked over by the establishment. So it is a wonder I got an OAM, to be frank. But anyway, it was that sort of work in that sort of area, I suppose. Yeah.
So the human ecology, can you tell us a little bit about what you got involved with there when you wrote your PhD, and how you sort of synthesised what you were seeing and where you were heading with your career into that course, and then where you came out?
I'll preface that by describing one of the early chapters in the book, where the first chapter I call Gondwanan Arc, and I describe just how different Australia is to northwest Europe, where agriculture was brought from, the technologies and the ideas. So that was the first point. We had this ancient continent leached of nutrients compared to Europe, which was very young, much of it post-glacial. A lot of underlying salt, dry continental interior, unlike where weather was generated in Europe, etc. So totally different to when those early settlers arrived. And the other really important point is that the ecologies that had co-evolved over a long period in Australia to recycle these scarce nutrients were very collaborative, whether it was underground, microbial, or above ground with energy, etc., etc. So when these Europeans arrived, they applied what they had learnt, and the Australian landscapes disintegrated very quickly. And the process of that was that, and that's what I describe in the second part of the chapter, that if you think about Indigenous people, and that's a big stream in the book, because as Costa and I were saying, I'm still in kindergarten working with an Indigenous elder at home. But if you look at Indigenous peoples and even some of medieval farming communities, that they were of what's called the organic mind. They still saw themselves very much as part of Mother Earth. part of the system. By the time we went through from the Renaissance on, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and then the modern capitalist revolution, and God forbid, the lunacy now of this endless growth of economic rationalism, which is a destructive driver. When those Europeans arrived, they were carrying what you could call it the mechanical mind, which humans didn't see themselves as an indivisible part of Mother Nature anymore. From Newton on, we dissected the earth to understand it, the mechanical elements, how it worked, and we saw it as a substrate for exploitation, for profit, etc. And so that lack of understanding, an understandable lack of understanding that was brought here in the technologies to this totally different soil and climate was devastating. And so that's the preface statement, Costa. So what really attracted me about the new thinking in holistic thinking, which that course in human ecology was where you don't just consider any issue in a reductionist manner, just looking at narrow scientific constraints or issues. You've got to look at the whole picture, and only from that do we start to understand these holistic systems and the way they work, because they do work in extraordinary holistic manners, and you can't just dissect them into any one sphere. So that's the significance of that. Yeah.
Mm. Now, I noticed in my reading there was a term there where you said it's a call to arms. So that vocabulary suggests, some serious movement, some serious change. How does that fit into, the basis of the Reed Warbler and what you're trying to pull together?
Yes, I also use the term this new type of farming, which is really an old type, going back to regenerating the soil. I use the term an underground insurgency, playing on the soil and a bottom-up, because there's no doubt in my mind that the Anthropocene crisis we're in, the solutions aren't going to come from the top. They're not going to come from the politicians, who are totally sceptical, most of them. It's not going to come from the big end of town, the big multinationals that are driving the whole industrial process, whether it's the Monsantos or the big food processors or the big retailers. So it's got to come from us. And the solutions are coming from the margin as far as agriculture, and they're coming from the margin as far as the urban food movement. My youngest daughter works in that in Melbourne, and it's an exciting space, as Costa well knows. And so that's what I mean, that the solutions to the Anthropocene, I can't see them coming from the traditional top area, because the whole of society is predicated on that. So it's got to be this radical returning to a basic caring for earth and society and healthy food, etc., and community that is going to drive it. So yes, a call to arms or this underground insurgency. So yeah, I'm preaching revolution.
Who were some of the regenerative change makers that set this process in motion for you?
Well, you can go back in your reading. It started in, Rudolf Steiner way back in the early 20s with biodynamics. And then a whole lot of British thinkers and scientists, Sir Albert Howard and Eve Balfour, for example. Howard and a number of other British scientists and thinkers got their ideas from looking at 4,000 years of farming in India, for example. And then you've got modern thinkers. Australia had some really good pioneers as well, post-Second World War, and even before, whether it was P.A. Yeomans with his water system. But great American thinkers like Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson and others who've written. Berry, we saw a film in Melbourne last night after I'd spoken, and great philosopher and thinker. And I was reading an article coming up in the plane by Berry, whose whole philosophy is embedded in love, his Christian love, and how ecology works and a return to real small farming communities. And because of his professorship in literature, he went back to Middle English and said the word culture in our language actually comes from agriculture. So if you think about agriculture with a hyphen, we're indivisible from it. So, and then in the book, I guess the modern innovators, and there's some extraordinary stuff. I really go through some of the key modern leaders as I deal with the book. So what, I guess, to probably preempt where you're coming from a bit, Costa, is looking at my own journey. I realised as a young farmer taking over a farm, and I remember about 10 days into my farming management, with my father still in hospital, I went out to a paddock one day and he's 40 dead sheep. And I'd left them on a paddock too long. Short grass with dew, and there's an intestinal worm called barber's pole that'll breed 100,000 eggs a day, and they just suck the blood out of these sheep. And so that was my learning curve. Now I've lost the train of thought where I was heading. My early journey, I think. Yeah.
The first 10 days.
Yeah. I'll pick the thread up. I was going to follow something important, and I've lost it. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
It'll come up. Oh yes, no, I know where it was. I realised at the end of this journey, as I started to encounter the regenerative farmers, that I was actually landscape illiterate. I couldn't read a landscape, whether it was functioning well or whether it was ill. And I don't believe most of we farmers can. And so what I've tried to do in the book was using a model from one particular scientist, an ecologist in Zimbabwe called Alan Savory, who's evolved the worldwide holistic grazing technique. And he delineated, if you want to think about landscape cycles, you could have dozens in there, chemical cycles and weathering cycles. But he'd simplified it down to 4 basic functions, landscape functions. And I've added the 5th, which is the big one. As one farmer said to me, that 1 square foot of real estate between our ears, this thing in here, and the worldviews or paradigms we carry. And so really the guts of the book, through lots of stories, is teaching about those 5 basic cycles: the solar cycle, the soil mineral, the water, and the biodiversity function, and then the human on top through story. And if you analyse what the great regenerative farmers are doing, they have learnt or intuitively developed an understanding of that and enable those things to work again. And I guess the second part of this is that when I did go back to uni, I had about 35 years of catch-up in thinking in ecology, because I'd gone off in a different area. So the advantage of that was coming fresh. And the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge amount of thinking across the disciplines in what are called complex adaptive systems, or complex, I call them complex creative systems. And it's come out of computers and systems thinking and way out physics theory like chaos theory, etc. And it's basically a system like the Earth, or even the World Wide Web, a human-made system, or your local landscape. If enabled, after it's disturbed, has a capacity to self-organise itself back to health. It's a matter of, it doesn't mean back to where it was, but back to a better state of resilience or health. And our interference as landscape managers usually inhibits that. But these leading, I kept hearing from these leading regenerative farmers, you mentioned Colin Sice in our discussion, and others, they kept telling me, look, my job's to get out of the way of Mother Nature. And I thought about that. And eventually, after getting my head around this idea of self-organisation, which is a key part of these systems, I realised intuitively that's what they were saying. And I personally think that idea of self-organisation in complex systems is one of the big ideas, possibly since Darwin's evolution ideas. So, and it just explains so much of how we can regenerate landscapes. But you've got to develop ecological literacy. You've got to be able to read a landscape to do that.
So I'm so relaxed here. Put the microphone down. Busy listening. I'm really enjoying this. I forgot that I've got a job to do. Keep it rolling. So where and how did your sensitivity to the land, so explain to people how you started to find this sensitivity. I mean, call it whatever we like, connection, understanding, sensitivity. How did that just start to bubble out? Was it through Was it through connections with your study? Was it your travel? Was it your being on the farm for so long that you started to understand the impact of things? Was it something that you can clearly explain to, non-farmers?
I hope so. As I said, I had a primary school teacher that got me into bird watching, and so that became a passion.
Okay, on that topic, hold that thought. Who had a primary school teacher that influenced their life? Yeah, see, it's interesting, isn't it? And you look back and what about a high school teacher? Do anyone have a high school teacher that sort of, and like, there's another story, but, our teachers, they're so maligned. That's a story for another day. I'll speak to Sam about a topic of talking about, valuing our teachers some more because you remember them. They planted a seed. That teacher planted a seed, but go on.
It did, and if you're going to do a red herring, I will. I was looking at some research the other day by the organisation Planet Ark, who looked at Australian children. I don't know how many states it went into. They looked at thousands of kids under the age of 6. Contemporary, this is in the last few years, and only 1 in 4 has ever climbed a tree or a rock. And they looked at under 10-year-olds, it mightn't have been Planet Ark, it might have been someone else. For every hour of outdoor play, 9 hours in front of a screen or a device. So this separation from nature is hugely alarming, and there's a lot of great programs in schools. And so yes, the power of primary teaching is just huge. Yes, I became a keen naturalist, and then I spent a lot of time rock climbing and mountaineering. And if you spend 4 days on a big rock face sleeping in hammocks, you become part of, you get into an almost mystical state, and you see wonderful things. And so that was on one side, and so I loved our birds and our mammals at home, and we're doing a lot of biodiversity work now. But at the same time, and this was my lack of ecological literacy, my farm management was still belting the landscape for decades. And so there was this separation in my mind. I was still part mechanical and part organic, if you like. And so that's a really interesting point. And it wasn't until, when I started actually doing regenerative farming and the university stuff and meeting these extraordinary farmers that I made more of a transition fully to the other side.
Farming as a reflection of the wider world. How did that play on this synthesis, this connection to the land, your sensitivity to it, and then starting to bring in this big picture that farming is a reflection of what's going on in the world and what's my role in that picture?
Thanks for the easy questions, Costa. I guess as a zoologist or biologist, I look at, we probably co-evolved in our major phase of our biological evolution in the African savannas over more than hundreds of thousands of years. And in the process of that, we became hardwired to detect hundreds, thousands of nutrients in our landscape, which in that process of co-evolution were integral to our health, our immune systems, etc. So your hunters were hunting meat, but those animals were grazing hundreds of different shrub species, which themselves have tens of thousands of what are called phytochemicals, your chemicals that comes through solar energy, but your phenols and your terpenes and your tannins and all that sort of stuff. And then the women were gathering the plants directly themselves with similar number of primary and secondary nutrients, not just your minerals, but your amino acids and all the other stuff. So internally, we have detection sensors in our alimentary canal, our guts, our organs, to tell our brain when we are lacking key nutrients to our health and our immune systems. And what modern industrial agriculture and food processing has done, and I'm talking about the way we process foods for the supermarket shelf, white goods, they're pretty much, etc., they're pretty much denatured of many of the key minerals and those thousands of phyto secondary nutrients I'm talking about. And then So that's one source of our food that's denatured. And then the second source is what we're doing with heaps of chemicals and fertiliser and to the soils themselves. And we're only going to get that wide variety of healthy nutrients from our soils if they're living and alive and cycling. And when you start pouring on industrial fertiliser, it's heavy metals and it's overloads of phosphorus and stuff, and your other chemicals, you're killing off the key hunters for those nutrients. And so the point I'm leading to is that where's the big picture here for all this? It's the fact that our entire modern Western civilization and its industrial food preparation and our industrial growing of it is really what's behind a lot of the huge escalation in modern health issues. Because if you think about, and I'm not going to simplify the obesity issue, it's a hugely complex adaptive issue, but part of it is the overindulgence in junk food is because all those detectors I was talking about in our organs, etc., are shrieking, I'm still hungry, because they're not getting the critical stuff for our entire immune system, much of which comes through our gut microbiome, that microflora. So all of us here, urban or rural, we're indivisibly connected because the system is increasingly broken.
The regenerative farmers that are making big change, for example, like Colin Syson, he's talking about multiple cropping, pasture cropping. You got Joel Salatin, who, you know, from an underground insurgency point of view, when Joel Salatin first came out to Australia back in 2009-10, I remember being in Brisbane and introducing him to his first talk, and there was a reluctance and a reticence by the powers that be to sort of see his message as someone just coming in a very public light, and they kind of just held it at arm's length. But that's changed. He's been coming to the country now for 8 years. I saw the day that he met Cole, and it was that meeting of the minds. There's many more people in regenerative agriculture, and people such as Darren Doherty and Regen, Regrarians, and then you've got Kim Cruz up in the north, and bringing regenerative agriculture through a permaculture lens into the NRMs, and the NRMs are the natural resource management groups. This shift is taking place. How rapid do you see this, and in what ways can it be pushed along by people?
That's a really good question. I'll go back first. I deliberately use the word regenerative agriculture because I'm still attached to the Fenner Research School of Environment and Society at ANU, and every paragraph nearly has got the word sustainability in it, and that's great. But I feel now that sustainability is a bit passé. It's sort of just marking time, holding firm. It's the connotations. Regenerative means an open-ended improvement going forward, and if you go back to its Latin roots, there's moral and ethical implications that are attached to the word as well. So that's why I use the word. And I deliberately, when I interviewed those 80 farmers, I chose as many areas of regenerative agriculture as I could, and in as many bioregions of Australia. So it wasn't just the easy, rich black soils of Darling Downs or something. And I'll quickly just describe the one that's impacting the most acres worldwide, or hectares, depending on your generation. About 30 million of them now in 5 continents is this holistic grazing that's come out of Alan Savory's work in Africa, which is then applied into some of the new cropping techniques. And then there's the new cropping ones. Costa just mentioned Colin Syce. There's 3 extraordinary world breakthroughs in Australian cropping that's come. And it hasn't come off the Darling Downs, the black stuff, or the Liverpool plains. It's come out of the really tough country. And what these farmers are doing with the new edible cereal and canola crops is they're drilling their crops in the autumn, when everyone else sows, directly into native grasslands, what are called the carbon 4, C4 grasslands that go dormant for the winter and wake up in the summer. So they're drilling them in then, depending on which technology, either no chemical and fertiliser or very little, and then they're using the animals and this holistic grazing to graze, because the new varieties are all grazable, and that has ecological impact of recycling dung and urine and stimulating the soil ecology. And then when harvest comes, just as they take the crop off, the grasses are waking up. So they've got, depending on the season, but they've potentially got a lot more green feed, and that's that solar cycle I was talking about, which pumps the sugar in the soil and drives the whole process of life, in fact. And so that's a huge revolution, and there's a spin-off of that in Western Australia that's hugely broadacre, and they're world breakthroughs. And then there's people involved. There's the permaculture people, which is about design as much as anything. There's your biological farmers of various constraints. There's your agroforesters. So there's a whole spectrum of what that regenerative farming's about. So that was part of the question. What was the second part?
Yeah.
Yep.
But on that topic of native grasses, you talk about, and you're totally connected with the work of Bruce Pascoe and the role of native grasses and the role of native yam daisies, and that the farming of massive areas of the country with native crops. That's another area that is intricately connected with what you're talking about in the book.
It is, and the second part of the previous thing I realised was you asked how that regenerative farming connected with everyone here. Well, it connects through the food, and people forget about fibre as well. I mean, we can grow magnificent fibre off these grasslands, animal welfare friendly, etc., etc. But the connection is through food. So what these different agricultural movements are doing is producing incredibly healthy, nutrient-dense, nutrient integrity food that directly goes back to correct what the lack of nutrients are doing in modern food to our health. So that's the connection there. And then your question just then?
Or the ever-increasing awareness and role that indigenous farming methods and indigenous grasses and indigenous root crops are becoming understood and starting to be used.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about it. Australia, recently the dates are pushed out to well into the 60,000s now, at least, when Indigenous people settled this continent. So the second oldest settled continent on Earth. And we know that for about 2,000 generations there's been management of this landscape. And that was Bill Gamage's great breakthrough. And I had coffee with Bill last week, and his book is still selling wonderfully, and he's a very humble man, but he's still copying it from some of the hardline ecologists who can't acknowledge that some of our landscape was managed for tens of thousands of years by Indigenous people, in Bill's case highlighting fire. But what Bruce Pascoe does is highlight that there was already a proto-agriculture well underway in Australia. Not to say that it was going to keep going, that probably held it where it was because it was appropriate to their lifestyle and the environment. But and I think that's still to unfold. But we know that they were cultivating yam daisies and harvesting eels and fish, and there's a massive grain belt across Australia that storing tons of grain, and some of the earliest unleavened bread manufacture in the world, well ahead of Europe or anywhere, was occurring in Australia, out from Lake Mungo and further out. So we've still got a lot to learn. It's appropriate, and some of those native grasses are extraordinarily adapted to use low phosphorus levels, etc., and a lot to be done there yet.
Low water and all of those details. Yeah, I've been out recently looking at some of these, and watch this space, because I think all of us in this room are capable of helping this awareness build by showing awareness in it. And the more awareness and the more drive we put behind it, then the more we have a capacity to open up, not just with grains and tubers, but an entire pantry of foods that is on our doorstep. Yet we still yearn and long for European flavours, when the more we look at this and the more we drive this and the more we give this capacity to Indigenous people to run, then their independence and their ability to direct their future will be free of the umbilical cord, and it's very exciting, and there's some good people working in that space, isn't there?
Some wonderful people, and I've been teaching recently at university in Melbourne called the William Anglis Institute that teaches the culinary arts, etc. And the irony there is that I'm a shocking cook, but what intrigued me was here's a key university on the culinary and hospitality arts, and they'd never, until I came along, when they asked me to teach, they'd never taught where food came from. But one of the things I do with my students, it's an hour or so out of Melbourne, the Otway Ranges were once beautiful forests, and parts of them still are. There's some wonderful farmers out there, and one farmer I take the students to, he took over his farm in the 80s when they'd gone from 90-odd% forest vegetation down to only 2% left, and it's degraded landscape, 20-foot deep gullies, etc. And he's now, and this is a common story in some of the farmers I studied in the biodiversity area, he's now regenerated his farm by plantings and other methods to over 20%. And his production's gone up on the original area. And he's working with Indigenous people, but what this diversity has enabled him to do, other than regenerating a landscape, instead of just one or two enterprises like sheep or cattle, he's now stacking in 7 or 8. So he's got a diversity of enterprises, cut flowers, bush tucker, and that's where he's working with the Indigenous people, and timbers, etc., etc. So it's the old story about having diversity in landscapes. But there's just wonderful stuff going on out there. And another story I tell is some people I know in southwest of Western Australia who are biodynamic farmers and use no chemicals or fertiliser, and they've got their own stone grinding mill, because probably most of you are aware, if you go through traditional industrial grinding, it destroys a lot of the enzymes and goodness in our grains anyway. The old stone grinding method doesn't. So they've got that, but he's hunted around and against opposition from big chemical companies, and that's another story, but he's been able to dig up the old cereal varieties from the late 19th century who didn't grow up with the drug fix of chemicals and a lot of fertiliser. And he finds that in his environment, with a healthy soil, his old varieties are way outperforming the industrial bred single trait varieties. And they're far more resilient to droughts, and they're better at hustling for nutrients, etc., etc. So there are upsides, many upsides, as well as human health that comes out of a lot of these good stories and directions.
From mechanical to regenerative thinking, you said there's three steps. Is that right? 3 steps in that change. Can you explain that a little bit in terms of?
Well, it was interesting. I suppose the 3 steps is the interim shift, but what I found, because when I interviewed the 80 farmers for my PhD thesis, the average interview was about an hour. And so to analyse their real thought, I studied their metaphor use of language. We're hardwired in our ancient brains for metaphor with our symbolic brains. It was part of our last modern step in evolution. And what I found that in those 80 farmers had done the shift, in 60% of the cases they'd shifted because they'd had a major life shock that had cracked the carapace of their mind, if you like. Burnt in a bushfire, marriage breakup, poisoned with chemicals. The 83 drought was a big one for a lot of us. And in the other 40%, it might have been a series of destabilisations. And so that's how embedded our mind is in tradition. And I guess there's an interim phase, which is probably the third one you're talking about, and that's where you need support because it's lonely and it's emotionally stirring to make this huge transformative shift. And there's now some really good, as these groups of regenerative farmers develop, there's some very sophisticated cultural, social learning stuff going on out there, and people's hands can be held and they can hear the stories and be reassured as they make what's really a major socially challenging move amongst their community.
I know that, I don't know where 49 minutes has gone, but I'd like to throw it open to any of you who would like to take anything we've chatted about and ask Charlie a question.
You can ask Costa too, if you like.
No.
Hi, it is actually a question for both of you. So something that I've come to realise over the last few years of speaking to regenerative farmers as both a sort of social researcher and an artist, is how much in my community in the city, where we have a lot of, there's a kind of natural environmentalist instinct amongst all of my friends. We love bushwalking, care about the forests, care about the Great Barrier Reef, but the food production system is kind of invisible. And in fact, I've come to realise how much contempt and sort of apathy, I guess, there is in an urban community about the way they feel about rural people. And I think the whole climate change denial kind of conversation pigeonholes or at least stereotypes a lot of farmers in a way that determines the way my generation think. And I'm just wondering if you both have something to offer around how we sort of reconcile these two movements. We have a really strong, youthful, environmentalist movement that isn't really taking on food as a kind of domain. I mean, there's the urban food, urban growing community, but it's quite small. Because I feel like that's just a great big barrier that sort of they're not talking to each other. The regenerative agriculture story and the environmentalist movement and the activism that's going on there.
That's a really good question. Yes, not every farmer votes for the National Party, don't worry about that. Many of us regard them as, and I'm probably going to tread on toes, but they certainly don't represent the thinking area of regenerative farming and other farmers. So that's a handicap where we can't do anything about. I think the great connector to help address, and it's going to grow slowly, but it's accelerating in places like Melbourne, and Costa would know more about that in Sydney. The great connector has to be, I'll come back a step, there's certainly a vested interest. If you look at politically, we're, in our politics and our business and economic structure, we're committed to industrial capitalism and this growth society and economic rationalism. So what we're talking about is really a threat to the entire edifice of the way Western civilization's now got itself into this predicament, which is tipped us into the Anthropocene. So that's huge stuff. And I think that the real connector has to be the healthy food of healthy landscapes and the urban gardens and all that movement. And that's organically growing. I don't know how we can accelerate it. I think it's growing, and I think as hopefully as more and more evidence comes in about the crossing of the 8 or 9 Earth systems that's precipitated us into the Anthropocene, that the denialists are going to run out of room. They'll be backed into a corner because at the moment it's just ludicrous what's going on. And my hope is that food, urban connection, and that growing area, and I would hope that environmental group you're talking about, I'm a bit surprised that there's a dichotomy between that and the food thing, which is interesting. I guess that's a bit black and white, that picture, but
reliance on Coles and Woolies. That's just part of all our life that we don't, it's so normalised that a lot of us don't interrogate just that as the way we're relating to the environment.
Look, on that topic, I think something like the war on waste has had a massive impact because it just came at that right time, and Charles was talking about this underground insurgency, and I can see faces in this room that are and have been doing great work in that space, chipping away. We've all been chipping away. But, so then along comes Craig Rewcastle and the war on waste, and what that did was just drag all of us up because it was just the right thing at the right time that hit a nerve and wasn't coming necessarily directly from an environment or an existing canister. It just came from that almost humour, right, that dragged people along, and that's helped all the people, the responsible runners doing, reducing litter on beaches and making people aware of the food they buy because, they saw so many bananas being thrown away because of a buyer that says it has to be 11.1 centimetres, not 11.3, otherwise we throw it out. So this has stirred the beast. And then you put onto that, this book, you put into it all these things going on. The youth food movement are doing wonderful things, and they're bringing youth in there. The Youth Climate Coalition are doing great things. So even though it can seem like the big end of food distribution has it locked up. People are driving change, and as we drive change within it, then you know it gives power and strength to the parallel universe as well. So yeah, I appreciate your question, but I think there's good things going on, and you know, books like this, books like what's happening with David Holmgren, that's about to come out, as I say, The War on Waste, they're coalescing, and I feel like people are more receptive.
You know, we need our Stephanie Alexander school programs and the primary school and secondary school. And one other thing, it would be good if we could clone Costa, because we need more of him out there, because he really is bridging that gap as well. So, and he won't like me saying that. But
It's very scary for the safety of our future.
it is, yes.
Yeah, good afternoon. I had a question about self-organising systems. I was up at the Warren Bungles recently, which was 90% burnt out in the 2013 fires. The cypress forests there do not seem to be regenerating in any way whatsoever. It's quite terrifying to walk through them, and I'm an ex-forest researcher from Gippsland, so I've seen some terrifying things happen in forests before. What can you see happening in these systems that have gone from one, you know, set kind of ecology and a kind of they're almost in limbo? What do you see happening to those through the Anthropocene, and what would you recommend as forms of management?
That is a hard question, because I'm no expert landscape ecologist, but it's a good question, because I would imagine these situations have happened over millions of years in Australia, which is, you know, in the Pleistocene, the ice ages, we would have had horrendous temperature changes, and our ecosystems must have shifted over time, and maybe we just have to come to terms with the fact that with increasing heat and more fierce fires, especially if we don't manage our national parks and some of those reserves in a sensible manner. In other words, if we could have senior Indigenous burners managing a lot of our national parks and forests, we'd have a lot less Holocaust fires than we're having at the moment, is my personal view. But maybe we've got to come to terms with the fact that as we get into these extreme events, there's going to be a whole-scale biota shifts and collateral damage. And let's have this discussion in 10 years and see whether there's been any colitis come back or whatever. But that's a huge question that I'm not qualified to answer. I'm sorry. Good question, though.
Thanks, Dave.
I've got a lot less scary question for you. I've learned a lot about permaculture and etc. And a really big part of the whole theory is about observation. So I'm just wanting to hear about the way that you observed as a traditional farmer compared to the way that you learned to observe as a regenerative farmer, and if it really changed the way that you noticed and looked and how you related to the information you saw and all that.
Yeah, a lot of good questions. I think anyone who's been a bird watcher, if, for example, if you come to the springtime and you're learning where a bird is nesting, there's lots of little minute indicators that triggers you to where they're going, and so you start to develop observational skills in that natural area, not just in birds, but other, you know, mammalian behaviour or whatever. And so I was reasonably good at that, but I still wasn't watching the minutiae in the landscape where I was farming. And when I began to make the shift, yes, you start to look at the diversity of plants, and either your desired perennials starting to emerge, and we now graze, we never try and graze more than 50% of our plant matter, and it's done very quickly, like off that African herd example of holistic grazing. And so you become far more attuned to your grassland ecology and your soil and your other indicators, and that goes with that mental shift. And it's, I don't think you ever stop refining that thing, but it's, the interesting thing in my mind was I was this keen naturalist, and yet my farming landscape, I'd separated that in my mind, and it just shows you the power of that paradigm that I was talking about. And so, but once you make the shift, observational skills, you're ever refining them, I think, and I've still got a long way to go.
Look, I was just wondering, what of the farming community, what percentage do you think are regenerative?
Because unless it increases, we're not going to get it.
Yes. I know that I don't know about the permaculture courses, Costa, but there's now just in the grazing, holistic grazing and associated courses, there'd be more than 10,000 farmers. And I think we've only got 70,000 in Australia that have done it. Now, that doesn't mean, given adoption rates and any new technology, that it's picked up, but there'd be certainly into the thousands now doing just that alone. Agroforestry is growing enormously through, and that's a type of forestry that's not industrial forestry with just radiata pine or something. It's integrated landscape management. There's thousands there, and so there's probably a lot more than we think. Maybe not producing the big volume that industrial grains are doing, etc. And my gut feel is it's slowly growing all the time, and you'd probably be aware of some of the more biological agriculture and permaculture numbers, but it's occurring. I'm not saying it's exploding, because you're up against a lot of power bases, and in our district, there might be 1,000 farmers. There's only about 8 or 9 of us still doing this new type of farming or biodynamics or whatever. So some areas are more conservative like ours than others, and but it's moving, yeah. I really can't tell you how quickly.
Valerie Brown made an interesting point. We'll finish off on this one. In the foreword, when she talked about this change, and you were tapping on it in terms of that change in observational skills, but she said there's 3 points: the readiness to change, collective learning, and everyone keeping an open mind and a trust and a willingness to listen. That really rang for me when I first looked at the book, because that's across the board, because as you say, farming affects all scales and all contexts, local, regional and planet. Yet those 3 things are really where processes break down, because someone doesn't want to keep an open mind, someone isn't ready to change, or they're not open to the idea of collective learning.
Yeah, I can't add to that. That's well summed up, I think, Costa. It's the capacity to have humility, I guess, and if you're inducted into a paradigm, that can be hard, yeah.
Well, I reckon 2 or 3 hours could just stroll by and we wouldn't even realise it'd be 6 o'clock. But alas, our time has sort of come to an end. Thank you for giving so much. I could feel it up here. It was just a wonderful opportunity to be able to welcome you to the library, Charlie, and to share and hear about just a little bit behind it all. And it's been a real opportunity to sort of take this and put it out there to others. And ultimately, if we put it all out there to others, then that conversation and that opportunity and willingness to listen and to share these ideas will get traction on the ground and will add to the insurgency.
Will, and I thank everyone for coming and being so constructive, and thank you, Costa. I think it's your leadership in this new space. ABC were, I thought, courageous when they grabbed you, but gee, they were foresighted, and you're doing a terrific role, and I wish we could clone you. So it's terrific, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.